I'm excited to welcome you to the fourth and final breakfast briefing of 2018. My name is Hunter Hill. I'm a member of the BGR Board of Directors and the chairman of the Breakfast Briefing Committee. BGR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research firm dedicated to informed policymaking and the effective use of public resources. BGR's reports identify opportunities and solutions on high-leverage issues in local government. We monitor more than 70 government entities across Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Tammany parishes. BGR's goal is the improvement of government in the greater New Orleans area. Breakfast briefings further BGR's mission by allowing citizens and policymakers to discuss issues that affect all of our lives. We hope you'll take advantage of our question and answer portion of today's program. On your seat, you should have found a flyer that gives instructions on submitting questions using the Slido website. Today's event code for the Slido website is G527. Again, that's G527. If you prefer to write your questions, please hand it to a BGR staff member and include your name if you'd like to be identified. The best way to stay on top of all BGR events and research is to become a member. Last year, we put plans in motion to regularly engage with our members about our public policy work. BGR values this dialogue, and we appreciate our members' support in amplifying BGR's good government recommendations. So if you're not already a member, please consider joining the ranks of concerned citizens working to improve local government. Finally, I'd like to encourage everyone to get your tickets soon, if you haven't already, to the BGR's annual luncheon. The luncheon will be held on Friday, December 7th at 12 o'clock at the Marriott Hotel on Canal Street. This year we have a dynamic speaker that we're very excited about, Michael Leiter. Michael led counterterrorism operations for Presidents Bush and Obama. He is also an expert in cybersecurity. BGR is excited to bring Mr. Leiter to New Orleans to share his insights at a time when we are all processing daily news of foreign and domestic threats. To purchase a table or tickets to the luncheon on December 7th, please visit our website at bgr.org/luncheon or take a flyer at the door. And now, to introduce our topic this morning is Dennis Woltering. Many of you know Dennis as the former news anchor for WWL-TV. He continues to serve our community and is an active member of the BGR board. This time I'll turn it over to Dennis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Hunter. I'd like to express my gratitude to Iberia Bank for its generous sponsorship of BGR's Breakfast Briefing Series in 2018. Their support allows BGR to make these events free to the public. I would also like to acknowledge BGR's President and CEO, Amy Glavinsky, and BGR's award-winning staff. They do a fantastic job of planning and executing these quarterly events. As he enters his fourth year in office, Governor John Bel Edwards faces a full plate of issues important to citizens and businesses in the New Orleans metro area. Some are quite prominent, others are less visible. But all of them face the common challenge of funding constraints in an era of significant pressure on state budget appropriations and limited taxing ability. While Louisiana avoided the fiscal cliff in 2018, the governor must continue to work with the legislature to set the state's funding priorities. And there is no shortage of major needs here in the New Orleans area. Some of the biggest include investing in education at all levels, from early childhood through higher education, ensuring successful implementation of the 2017 reforms to the criminal justice system, and building upon those reforms, addressing long-term funding gaps in the master plan for coastal restoration, building and maintaining state roads and infrastructure on which citizens and businesses depend, and encouraging job creation, workforce training, and economic development in the New Orleans area. Here today to share his perspective on these issues and discuss the priorities for 2019 is Governor John Bel Edwards. Thank you for joining us, Governor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You know, hearing Dennis run down the list of things we're still contending with makes me scratch my head. No, the truth is we've made significant progress over the last 3 years. I'm excited to be your governor, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here with you this morning. And Hunter, thank you and Iberia Bank for hosting this breakfast, and I want to thank Dennis for the introduction. The fact of the matter is Louisiana has come a long way over the last 3 years, and a lot of significant progress has been made. And while I don't like to talk about it too much because it brings back some rather painful memories, the fact of the matter is when I came into office in January 2016, we were $1 billion short to close out that year, less than 6 months later. And for the year that started, the fiscal year that started July 1st, 2016, we were more than $2 billion state general fund short. And despite that, we had cut higher education more than any other state in the nation over the previous 8 years. Another $3 billion had evaporated out of the trust funds that had been swept into the operating account and lined up against recurring expenditures, even though it was non-recurring revenue. So we desperately needed stability. We desperately needed predictability, the same thing that you all want in your businesses, in your operations. And we were finally able to achieve that, as Dennis mentioned, in this most recently concluded special session. I will be the first to admit, it took longer than it needed to, and it was a little harder than it should have been, huh, Walt? But we're there. We are there, and I appreciate that. So we reached a bipartisan compromise to fund our critical priorities, to give our state budget the stability and predictability we've long needed. And I will tell you, we have a responsible budget in place today. One of the first things that happened was that the credit rating agencies took note and improved our credit rating, took us off the negative watch list. We no longer have deficits weighing us down. In fact, I can tell you for the last 2 years running, we've actually closed out each of those fiscal years with a small surplus. Now, why does that matter? Well, first of all, if you have a deficit at the end of a year, then you've got to pay last year's bills with this year's revenue. You then open a hole this year that you have to respond to immediately with mid-year cuts. I don't need to tell you how destabilizing those are because that's the pattern we were in year after year after year. So it's a good thing to have these surpluses. The surplus for the most recently concluded fiscal year is right at $300 million. Now, why do we have that surplus? It's simple. We have more people working, making more money, and more businesses more profitable than economists had forecasted. Those are all good things. It's also a good thing to have the revenue to make investments. Dennis was talking about the need to fund some coastal projects. Guess what? That's one of the things you can do with surplus. You can also do capital construction projects. You can pay state debt. You're going to have to put 25% of it to the rainy day fund, another 10% to the unfunded accrued liability on our pension system. But these are good things to invest in. And so I'm very proud of the stability that we have. I'm proud of the progress that we have been able to make. And so that surplus was for last year, the year that ended on June 30th. For the year that started July 1st, we reduced the tax burden on the state of Louisiana by right at $600 million. And that, again, is because the economists are forecasting that the economy is going to continue to grow, employment is going to continue to be strong, and businesses are going to be profitable. So we were able to do that. As a result, for the second year in a row, higher education is funded without any reduction. We're meeting our obligation to every student in the state with respect to TOPS. And need-based aid for higher education and Go Grants is funded at the highest level in our state's history this year, because education is synonymous with opportunity. It's always been the case, but it's never been more the case than it is right now. And so we're actually instilling confidence, inspiring confidence in people, not just in Louisiana and around the country, but really around the world, who are making investment decisions about where they are going to invest their dollars to either expand an existing operation in Louisiana or to create a new presence in Louisiana. And that is creating opportunity for our people to get good jobs and to have good careers. So the economic outlook is good and improving. The Bureau of Economic Analysis released a report showing that personal income in Louisiana grew at the second greatest rate in the nation for the second quarter of this year, 5.9% annualized. Only Texas was higher at 6%. The Bureau of Economic Analysis also reported recently that Louisiana's GDP for the first quarter of 2018 grew at a rate of 2.3%, faster than that of 35 other states. No state's unemployment declined more than Louisiana's last year. Just last week, Site Selection ranked Louisiana number 10 in the nation for best business climates. And every day, we are working hard to land new, exciting economic development projects, and we are winning those projects. They're going to pay dividends for years to come. Down here in New Orleans, 1 year ago today, I announced that DXC technology was coming. The biggest economic development project win in our state's history with 2,000 direct jobs right here on Poydras Street in New Orleans. And I want you to think about something for a second. There were more than 30 cities across the country competing for that. It ended up a head-to-head competition between New Orleans and Nashville. And New Orleans won. That's exciting. Do you know why New Orleans won? First of all, it's a great place to be. You all know that. You know that. 300 years old. 300 years with organized government. Now, the fact of the matter is, government down here hadn't always been organized. But I congratulate New Orleans anyway. But we have young people, well-educated people moving into New Orleans today. And for those of you who've been in New Orleans for a while, you know that for a couple of generations, the exact opposite was happening. So this is an exciting time for Louisiana and for New Orleans. But think about it, 2,000 direct jobs, another 2,200 indirect jobs, and the demand for the services that DXC is providing across the globe is actually growing faster than they had anticipated. So there's every chance that they're actually going to do more in New Orleans than they were committed to. And why did they make the commitment? They made the commitment because Louisiana finally said, we are going to fund higher education. They are not going to spend their money, and not just DXC Technologies, but for all of the economic development projects coming forward. They're not going to spend their money in Louisiana if they don't have educated, skilled, trained workers here that they need to be successful. And so by prioritizing education, by funding it appropriately, you create opportunity for Louisiana citizens to get the education, and then you bring in the jobs that they need to fulfill those opportunities. The biggest part of the upfront payment with respect to DXC Technologies was not money that the state gave DXC to pay for their relocation expense. It was money that Louisiana gave to higher education in Louisiana, so that UNO and Delgado and Southern and LSU and Southeastern could have the programs that they needed to have in order to make sure DXC would be successful. That is the new model going forward, and I'm excited about it. I know that it works. Now, I'm also excited about some other things that we did, and I'm mindful of the time limitation that we have this morning, and I'm going to be taking questions shortly from you all. But I will tell you that Medicaid expansion in Louisiana has worked extremely well for our state. The rate of uninsured in Louisiana for adults is the lowest it has ever been, from almost 1 in 4 to right at 1 in 10 today. And yeah. $470,000 working poor people with health care coverage. And the reason the state needed to do it is because for generations, we've had too many people uninsured. Our health outcomes have not been what we would want them to be. And as you know, we had severe fiscal constraints. Well, we've saved over $300 million state general fund over the first 2 years with Medicaid expansion, because if someone is uninsured and they go to the hospital, it costs us 40 cents on the dollar to treat them. But I can insure them for no more than 10 cents on the dollar. And the 40 cents comes from the general fund where we are short. The 10 cent comes from a statutory dedication that we wouldn't have but for the fact that we expanded Medicaid. It's just the right thing to do. And we're giving people an opportunity to have a higher quality of life, to stay in the workforce longer, and in many cases, to live. Because if you're too late getting diagnosed with breast cancer or colon cancer, guess what? Your chance of surviving that go way down. And giving people an opportunity to get primary care and preventative care, the diagnostic evaluations they need, is just the right thing to do. And so we are moving the needle. Criminal justice reform. By looking at what other Southern conservative states did successfully, last year I signed into law 10 bills, 6 authored by Republicans, 3 by Democrats, and 1 by an independent who is here with us today. Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate you, Joe Marino. And yet Walt, he authored some of those bills too. So thank you very much, Walt. We found out, for example, that we had the nation's highest incarceration rate, which we already knew, but the leading crime driving that was drug possession. No other state in the nation was treating that crime in that way. And so borrowing from what other states had done successfully, we created more alternatives to prison. We made sure that the sentences actually reflect the severity of the crime. We're going to reduce the recidivism rate, reduce the crime rate. We're going to be safer, reduce the incarceration rate, and 70% of the savings will go back into criminal justice reform efforts to make sure that we are successful, that we're providing education and training, drug treatment, and mental health treatment to individuals, because 95% of our inmates are going to get out. But they were getting out having not been prepared for success. Now we're going to do a better job of preparing them for success. We will be safer because for every unsuccessful reentry, at least one new victim of crime is created. And for the first time in decades, your governor can stand before you and tell you Louisiana no longer has the highest incarceration rate in the nation. And I am proud of that. I don't want to overdo it. We're number 2. But you got to start somewhere. You got to start somewhere. Look, coming up, I will tell you that in the session that we have, I agree with Dennis. He talked about the challenges around education. The fact of the matter is, if you account for the impact of inflation, we've reduced our investment in K through 12 education over the last number of years because we did not do what we have always hoped to do, what is embedded in the MFP formula, and that is an annual 2.75% increase. We just haven't been doing it. We will do that this year coming up. We are going to give teachers a pay raise because they haven't had one. We are now $2,200 below the Southern Regional average in teacher pay, whereas 10 years ago we were at Southern Regional average in teacher pay. 35% of the kids in Louisiana schools are being taught by either a teacher who is not certified or is not certified to be teaching what they are teaching. And we need to do better than that. We need to attract more people into the teaching profession, and we need to keep them there. The number one ingredient for quality education is to have a highly motivated professional teacher in that classroom. And we have to do better. We're going to give a $1,000 teacher pay raise this year, $500 support worker raise this year, and announce our plan to close that $2,200 shortfall over the next 3 years. Incredibly important for the state of Louisiana if we're going to close the achievement gap, which we absolutely need to do and that we will do. We're also going to make sure that we're doing more with respect to continuing to advocate for and securing a higher minimum wage for the people of Louisiana. $7.25 is not a reasonable wage. You know, we have a neighboring state, Arkansas. They went to $8.50 an hour a while back. You saw them vote last Tuesday. A week ago today, they're going to go to $11 over the next 3 years. Missouri voted for a higher minimum wage as well. We're one of the 5 states without our own minimum wage, and I will tell you, $7.25 in 2018 is just not a meaningful wage, and we are trapping too many people in poverty, especially young people, when we don't pay their parents what they are worth. And we need to do better than that. And speaking of paying what people are worth, we have the largest pay gap in the country in terms of gender-based pay. That is offensive to me. That is offensive to me. And we need to do better than that. And if we could just make headway with some common sense legislation such as ending pay secrecy, this problem will pretty much take care of itself. But we have to do it. Yeah, I think the pay gap is somewhere around 60 cents on the dollar is what women make on average compared to their male counterparts. But for a woman of color, it's about 50 cents on the dollar. The worst in the nation. And I know some people say, well, we don't really have a lot of confidence in the way that they figure out what those pay gaps are. Well, they do it the same way in every state. They do it the same way in every state. But when a woman shows up at the store to buy groceries or goes to buy a car, they don't charge her 60 cents on the dollar what they charge other people. So we just have to do better in Louisiana. I will tell you, we're going to continue to make headway in health care. You know, one of the things that concerns me is the Attorney General joined in a lawsuit that if it's successful, would threaten coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, and we only have 850,000 of those in Louisiana. There's not a family in our state of any size that doesn't have someone with pre-existing conditions. And so we're going to be moving forward in Louisiana that should his ill-advised lawsuit be successful, we will actually have some legislation on the books to afford some protection for those individuals. We're going to do more with respect to fighting the opioid epidemic and strengthening the prescription drug monitoring program, build on the efforts that we've already done to limit the prescriptions for acute pain to 7 days, which is incredibly important. About 70% of the people today on heroin started with prescription drugs with a prescription. And they developed an addiction. And so if we can get on the front end of that and stop the addictions from happening, then we won't deal with as much of it on the back end as well. So we've got a lot of work to do and no shortage of challenges. But I'm excited to be the governor of the great state of Louisiana because today we're in a much better place to deal with the challenges that we have in front of us. We're going to be able to do more and be more proactive and not as reactive as we've been over the last several years. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you individually and with the BGR as we move forward. And I will tell you that I am very much mindful of how important New Orleans is to the state of Louisiana. And quite frankly, that hasn't always been the case with governors. It really hasn't. And it is incredibly important to the state of Louisiana that New Orleans does well. And I am aware of that. I want to work with the mayor and the council and the New Orleans delegation in the House of Representatives and in the state Senate to make sure that we are good partners and that we can continue to move forward together and that we can take advantage of all of the wonderful things that are happening in New Orleans and around the state of Louisiana. So I want to thank you again for the invitation to be here with you this morning. I look forward to working with you as we enter a new year and as we enter into a new era of prosperity for our state. And I want to thank you and tell you that I look forward to and I'm happy to take your questions, but I'm going to reserve that until the questions are asked. No, it's good to be here with you, and thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Governor. In keeping with BGR tradition, we do have a few questions from the audience. First of all, you talk about increasing the minimum wage. What should the minimum wage be in your view?
Yeah, well, I've asked for it to go to $8.25 and then a year later to $8.50. That is a modest but meaningful increase that will make a big difference for a number of folks across the state of Louisiana. And I just want to ask you, the next time you stop at a convenience store and you get a tank of gas and you go inside and you buy a cold drink or a beer or a daiquiri, whatever it is that you buy, bag of potato chips, I want you to add up what that just cost you. And then think about that clerk who took your money working for $7.25 and figure out how is that clerk, probably a young lady, supposed to support herself and that child that she may have at home based on $7.25. So $8.50 over a couple of years is, I think, a meaningful but modest increase that will go a long way to making a positive difference in the state of Louisiana.
Governor, how would you assess progress of implementing the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Program adopted in 2017, and is any additional legislation needed to support it?
Well, we're going to continue to look at additional legislation and whether the legislation needs to adjust what we've already done or move forward on other areas of criminal justice, and we're going to continue to work on that. I will tell you that there are all of the indicators thus far, all the data that we have at our disposal are very positive. For example, those individuals who have been released, all of whom were serving sentences for nonviolent, non-sex offenses, all of them had release dates already in the system, and they got out a few days to a few weeks, maybe a couple of months early, because for those crimes, rather than doing 40% of their sentence, they were only required to do 35% of them. The rearrest for those individuals thus far has actually been lower than the national average, but you have to be very careful because you typically measure recidivism over a 3 to 5 year time horizon. And so if you get out there too early and you say, well, we know we've been successful, well, you can't really know that. But all the data we have suggests that we are on track to achieve our goals, which is lower recidivism, which is a lower crime rate, and to save money that we then reinvest. And one of the most significant things, and this is the bill that Walt Leger authored, in the first year, Pew had forecasted that we would save about $6 million on the criminal justice system based on the reforms that we implemented. We actually saved 12. Now, the law requires us to reinvest 70% of the savings in the criminal justice arena to make sure that we're successful, 20% of which, by the way, goes to victims. Crime victims, and to making sure that their voices are being heard and that at the end of the day they feel like justice has been done. Well, this year we were successful. We reinvested right at $8 million in our criminal justice system, exactly as the legislature had intended, and we did that in a year where we faced the loss of $1.4 billion in state general fund revenue. Now, why is that significant? Because if you go back and you look at the history of the state of Louisiana, every time the promise was made that if we achieved savings, they would be reinvested, the promises were, the savings were actually pocketed to deal with budget constraints. We actually were disciplined and focused, and we did what we said we would do, and I can tell you it is making the difference that we want for it to make for our state. So I am very happy with where we are. The data looks very promising, but if anybody tells you that we can declare it a success and spike the ball in the end zone, they would be premature.
Kendall Dix of the Gulf Restoration Network asks, land loss is an existential threat. Will you commit to prioritizing coastal restoration over industrial development if they are in conflict?
You know, that's a hypothetical question. I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of it in terms of prioritizing one over the other. Now, we have a $50 billion master plan, and we envision investing $50 billion over 50 years. Now, why $50 billion? Because that's the most we think we might possibly have access to. We haven't identified $50 billion, but we finally have significant amounts of revenue that are available to us now and will be available in the coming years because of the BP oil spill and because of more revenue sharing with Go Mesa and some other things that have been done. I will tell you that when it comes to coastal restoration, we are going to allow science to dictate what we do and what we don't do. because if we don't maximize the role of science, then there's no way to minimize the role of politics. And the politics on this are very, very difficult. But it's the right thing to do. And the other thing is, if you don't maximize the role of science, then you don't create confidence in what we're doing, not just across Louisiana, but with the federal government. Because eventually, if we're going to be successful, we're going to have to get the federal government to help us to a greater degree. And so I am committed to coastal restoration. It is a problem in our state right now like no other in the country, but it's a problem that's going to visit other places in this country and around the world. And it actually gives us an opportunity to get on the front side of that and develop expertise and experience that will become an exportable commodity. And in fact, I just came back from Israel. One of the things Israel asked us to do was bring over folks from the Water Institute on the Gulf so that they could collaborate with the folks in Israel. Now, their problems are totally different than ours. We have too much water, they don't have enough. But we all have water quality problems, and we can all learn from one another. And so we actually brought folks from the Water Institute of the Gulf to Israel with us. They signed a memorandum of understanding with the Zuckerberg Water Research Institute at Ben-Gurion University, and they're going to collaborate together going forward. That is going to be the first of many. You just watch what happens over the coming decades when people turn to Louisiana to figure out how do they deal with sea level rise, with subsidence, with coastal erosion. Because we're going to develop a level of expertise here that will be unmatched anywhere in the world. But I don't believe that we have to sacrifice economic development and industrial expansion in order to do that. Now, we have to be smart. There are probably some places we ought not be putting industry if we've got a receding coastline and sea level rise, and if we're going to undertake various infrastructure projects, you can't put a facility where you need to do that. So we're going to have to work very hard. One of the things we did recently is my entire cabinet, not just CPRA, my entire cabinet came to New Orleans for 2 days last month for an exercise that was conducted for us by the Center for Planning Excellence all around coastal erosion, restoration, and what that means for the state going forward, and how we all have a role to play in that. It's something that is incredibly important. And as if you didn't know it, and if there wasn't a sense of urgency before, 5 years ago, we had basically a best case scenario, a medium case scenario, and a worst case scenario. And then 5 years later, what we have today is yesterday's worst case scenario is today's most likely scenario with respect to land loss going forward. So we're absolutely in a race against time, and we have to do what we can.
Governor, you vetoed a bill last session that prohibited local governments from adopting inclusionary zoning. Was this because you feel it's state overreach in local matters, or do you agree with the policy of inclusionary zoning?
Well, both. Look, I had a lot of individuals, primarily from Shreveport and New Orleans, told me that they wanted an opportunity to work with the city councils and the mayors in order to pursue that zoning. Now, nothing had prevented them from doing it in the past. It hasn't happened. And so at the time I vetoed the bill, which would have prohibited that, I did serve notice on municipalities across the state of Louisiana, local government. If this is something you're interested in, you need to do it. And if you're not going to do it, we'll turn the page on it, and we'll figure out some other way to try to make sure that we have affordable housing. But that's one of the biggest challenges in New Orleans today is affordable housing. And it's a problem. It's a good problem to have, but it's a problem nevertheless because we do have so much investment in New Orleans and so many people moving in, and so much of that development is in areas of the city where people have lived for generations, and all of a sudden the cost of that housing is just out of their reach. And so we have to do something, and I didn't want to take a tool out of the toolbox of local government prematurely, but if it's a tool that they intend to use, I'm encouraging them to do it because I can tell you there is a strong sentiment in the legislature that type of zoning not be allowed.
Governor, as you know, the Montreal Convention Center is considering a significant public investment in a new convention hotel. Do you have an opinion on the project and the extent of public contributions?
Yes, I do. First of all, I favor the convention center having an anchor hotel attached to the convention center. If you look at other places in the United States, that's what they've done. They are successful. We will become less competitive going forward if we don't do that. We have an entire side of this huge, beautiful convention center that is underutilized today because nobody wants to go further away than they have to from the Hilton Hotel because people are walking to get down there. And so I think having that anchor hotel attached to the convention center is important. And I've encouraged the folks on the commission there to explore the opportunities, the possibilities of creating that hotel. Now, I want to make sure that they negotiate the very best deal that they can for the state of Louisiana. And I know the difference between a proposal and a deal. There has been a proposal, there is not yet a deal. And so I've encouraged them to make sure that they continue to work with the folks who are would-be developers. And if we can't get it done this time, we'll get it done some other time. But it is something that we need to do if we're going to continue to have tourists come to New Orleans in ever greater numbers going forward. And so I do support the concept. I've asked them to move forward, but to do so in a very responsible way, a way that where at the end of the day, we can just look at the people in New Orleans around the state of Louisiana and tell them we know we did what's best for our city and for our state.
Do you have any thoughts about the size of the hotel and the extent of public investment?
Well, none that I'm going to get into today. Obviously, the bigger the hotel and the less we have to pay, the better. But I don't know where that sweet spot is, and I'm not. I know that came across as a little bit flippant, but that's part of the negotiating the deal. I mean, we want the best deal that we can, and we want to make sure that if there's a point in time when the hotel comes back under the direct control and ownership and management of the convention center, that it has been invested in recently, and so there's ways to do that, and you can incorporate all of those things into a deal. But obviously getting the right size hotel at the best possible cost to the state of Louisiana. Go ahead now looking forward to the date when that hotel returns to or becomes fully owned and controlled and managed by the convention center. You know, that's the way we want to move forward. But I do believe it's a worthwhile project for the city of New Orleans.
Okay. Member of the audience asks, can you support a greater portion of the sales and hotel tax going back to the New Orleans General Fund rather than the convention center?
No. And the reason I can't do that is because we have bonded debt that we have to pay, and we're looking at increasing our investment in that facility, and by the way, in the Superdome as well, so that the convention center remains a very competitive place, and so that the Superdome does as well. And so I'm not at all interested in taking some part of the revenue stream that the state currently has and with which we pay debt currently and that we plan to make improvements going forward and redirect those dollars, because if we do that, we're not going to make the improvements that we should make to those facilities, and they won't be competitive. Look, we have a Super Bowl coming in 2024. I'm very happy about that. But if you look at what dome stadiums look like today and compare them to the Superdome, and that's a great building. And by the way, many dome stadiums have been built and torn down since that one was built. But we kid ourselves if we think we don't have to continue to invest in those buildings and make them more modern, and increase the revenue generating capacity of the buildings, even if you don't increase the number of seats in them. And there are ways to do that. But I have charged my commissioners at the Stadium and Exposition District and at the Convention Center to maximize the value in these facilities so that we know that they are going to continue to draw people for decades to come. It's part of that thing about, I said earlier, about New Orleans being such an exciting place and so important for the state of Louisiana. Think about New Orleans without that convention center, or with a weak convention center. Think about New Orleans without that Superdome. You know, so I'm not interested in losing any part of the revenue stream that we use for those facilities.
Governor Mitch Gibbs of WGSO Radio asks, what is your position on legalizing sports betting in Louisiana? Mississippi has done so, and Louisiana money is leaving the state.
Yeah, I think it's something that we should do. I will tell you there is a study that has been commissioned by the legislature because I know that the legislature wants to take a good hard look at this in the session that comes up in April. And at the end of the day, as I understand it, sports gaming in and of itself won't produce a lot of net new revenue for the state of Louisiana. But if we don't do it, then the overall gaming revenue is going to decrease because those individuals are not going to be stopping at our casinos and riverboats. They're going to be going over to Mississippi where they can do the sports betting. And so we're doing the study now because there are many different ways to do it. There are different models out there. You can follow the model set by Las Vegas and the state of Nevada. You can do what's been done up in New Jersey. You can do something similar to Mississippi, and I know that we are looking at that. But I believe that we should take a serious look at it, probably get it done sooner than later, because every day that we wait, we will lose revenue to the state of Mississippi, revenue that's going to be paid by our folks here in Louisiana who just decide not to go to the casinos here. But exactly how we do that, how we phase that in, I'm going to work with the legislature, and we will see what that report shows at some point before the April session starts.
Governor, the Legislative Auditor's Office has found that at least 83,000 people falsified their eligibility to receive Medicaid benefits that they otherwise would have not received. What is the state doing about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Trump administration recognized Louisiana as being one of the 4 best states in the country when it comes to fighting Medicaid fraud. And I don't know which report you're referring to. I don't know that they said that there were 83,000 people who did that. I think what they said was it's possible that up to that many people had. It's something we take very, very seriously. And you got to understand that Medicaid expansion is based on, the eligibility is based on what your current income is. So it's not based on what you made last year. It's not based on what you think you're going to make next year. And so we adopted standards for eligibility that were fully consistent with what the federal government required. We're going to continue to scrub eligibility going forward because I believe in making sure that we are faithful to the expansion, that we run a good program, because I don't want people to lose confidence in what we're doing. And so we're going to continue to do that. But I would point out that the Trump administration singled out Louisiana as being one of the 4 states in the country doing the most to root out fraud in the Medicaid system with respect to eligibility.
All right, Governor, please discuss any changes you would like to see in Louisiana's minimum foundation program, the MFP for public schools. Yeah,
and I mentioned some of this earlier in my talk. So the minimum foundation program, that is the funding formula by which we fund K through 12 education. It was envisioned in that formula that we would have an inflationary increase every year. We have had, I think, 1 of those in the last 8 years, or maybe 2 in the last 10. And so the schools have fallen behind. Secondly, we typically take half of the increase and we give it to teacher pay. Well, if you don't have an increase, you're not increasing teacher pay, and that's how we went from being at the Southern average to $2,200 below the Southern average. So I want to give the full 2.75% increase this year in the MFP. I want half of that to go to teacher pay. The other half will go to, as a block grant, as it is designed, to our various school districts. That will not be enough, however, to get the teacher pay up by the $1,000 that I mentioned. And when I say teacher pay, I mean all credentialed employees. So you could be a nurse, you could be a counselor, but primarily teachers at $1,000, support workers at $500. A 2.75% increase will be somewhere around $80 million. Will not be enough to do that. We're going to have to come up with another $40 million or so in order to get the full amount of the raises that I talked about. But increasing the per pupil allocation inside the MFP is incredibly important. And once you do that, it does enjoy constitutional protection. That's one of the areas that is fully protected by the Constitution. I think it's the right thing to do. I mentioned before, if you choose not to invest in education, you do that at your own peril.
Governor, final question from Scott Whitaker. Will Louisiana apply for federal funding for the proposed passenger rail service between New Orleans and Baton Rouge?
We are looking at every possible source of funding that we can. And of course, whatever the non-federal match is, we have to have a revenue stream that we can count on to meet our obligations with respect to that. I will tell you, it's a shame, but years ago, we missed maybe the best opportunity we're ever going to have to accept federal dollars to create that rail link between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And why is that important? Because Baton Rouge and New Orleans ought to be a super region that together competes against other places in the country. And we should stop thinking as New Orleans and Baton Rouge being competitors in and among themselves. And how great would it be to live in New Orleans, work in Baton Rouge, or to live in Baton Rouge and take the train to recreate in New Orleans, or to go to the airport to fly out, whatever it is. So New Orleans, Baton Rouge really ought to function more like Minneapolis, St. Paul, like Dallas and Fort Worth. But if we don't create that linkage between the two, we're never going to get there. Rail is a big part of that. For one reason, it'll take some of the cars off the road that caused my commute this morning to be almost 2 hours. You know, so we can do better. Thank you very much. Look, thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Governor. We appreciate you being here. Thanks again to Iberia Bank for generous sponsorship of the Breakfast Briefing Series. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We hope this event has been informative and that we'll see you again in the future.